Hi, my name is June. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, welcome. If you're not, hey. Anyways, today we have a pretty big topic and something that's been on my mind for the last couple of days. Something that I think will really contribute to everything going on and hopefully well into the future as well. Probably going to be a very long video. Buckle up, strap in, whatever you need to do. So the video, if you haven't read the title, is Moral Reasoning and How It Applies to Black Lives Matter. I think it does apply to many more things beyond that, but I want to draw some clear connections between moral reasoning as a concept and Black Lives Matter today. Structure, introduction. I'm going to dive in a little bit of why I'm talking about this and just to kind of ease into the topic. Next is what is moral reasoning, kind of going into the theories around it and the models that are established right now, giving ourselves enough of an understanding, I'm hoping, for today's discussion. And after that, how to develop moral reasoning through discussion and environment. And then finally, application. How does this knowledge apply to BLM today, as well as just in society in general and moving forward? Why moral reasoning? In some ways, I think it's self-explanatory, but a lot of the social dynamics or interactions around BLM, you see a lot of arguments that are cognitive or wanting to be cognitive in nature, trying to convince each other through rational thinking or reasoning or facts. And I'll touch upon this a little bit later in the video, but I don't think that's the best way to navigate such a nuanced and complex and huge topic such as the oppression of Black people and anti-racism. Often in these conversations, I find that there's a lack of appeal to EQ as well as IQ. And I think moral reasoning does a good job of filling those gaps where there is a good amount of ethics and empathy in the discussion, as well as cognition and comprehensive knowledge of what's going on. And often I think where these arguments hit a halt or a standstill where no more progress will be made is because of something that happens in the article or is mentioned in the article that we're going to be talking about today. So the article, I have it up here, The Cognitive Developmental Approach and the Practicing Counselor, an opportunity for counselors to rethink their roles. So it's an article that I'm reading for my counseling course, but I thought it applies to much more than just counseling. It's written by Lawrence Kohlberg and Elsa R. Wasserman. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing these names right. We're going to be struggling with a few names today, so I apologize in advance if it offends anybody. I'm going to be referring to my notes a lot. Sorry, I really want to get this right. Right. So in the article, it says that people often have a logical and cognitive developmental stage that is higher than the corresponding moral stage. AKA, people are smart, they're not stupid, but oftentimes their moral development has not kept up with their cognitive development. And that is where I think we hit a huge divide in people, or where people don't know how to navigate how to argue with such a person, which is surprisingly common. I think it's like 50% or something in the article. In the article, it says, although logical development is necessary for moral development and sets limits to it, most individuals are higher in logical stage than they are in moral stage. As an example, more than 50% of late adolescents and adults are capable of full formal reasoning, but only 10% of these adults display principled moral reasoning. And we'll use this quote again later on. I think I have it in the notes again. But that just goes to show that it's very prevalent. A lot of people will be able to keep up with facts and that kind of thing, but they won't be able to keep up with the moral discussions around something. And that is why we are talking about this today. Okay, so in the field of psychotherapy and psychology, honestly, I'm not really sure what to call the field. I haven't really been paying attention to class. There are various developmental models. For example, we have Piaget's cognitive model, which breaks down cognitive development into stages that correspond with a certain age group. The pre-operational stage corresponds to the age bracket of 2 to 7 years, and during this stage, children typically develop language skills and recognize symbols, but will struggle seeing another person's point of view, and we call this egocentrism. Likewise, there is a model for moral development. The one mentioned in the article is developed by one of the authors himself, Kohlberg. So like I said, I haven't really been paying attention too much in class, so this might be a very simplistic view at these stages, but I think there are some main takeaways that will help us in our discussion today. The first one is that they're all invariant sequences, meaning that you can't skip a stage. They are a progressive development from one to the next. And also, stages build upon each other. It's evolutionary and it's accumulative. So everything you learn in stage 1 will stay with you until stage 6, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're just adding on new knowledge to each previous stage. You're not replacing it. And finally, in most of the models, the earlier stages will be very self-centered and you're thinking of yourself and things from your perspective. And as you progress, you begin to adopt the views and develop empathy or understandings of other perspectives. So here is where I want to go revisit that quote. More than 50% of late adolescents and adults are capable of full formal reasoning, but only 10% of these adults, all formal operational, display principled moral reasoning in stages 5 and 6. Mind you, this is a quote from an article written in 1980, so I don't know what the numbers are like today. I'm assuming that human behavior hasn't changed that much, though, and patterns have not changed that much. And I think the discussions that I'm seeing online really reflect the same thing. So let's assume that it's applicable to today. And what's important is to, again, take note that people are cognitively capable of morally reasoning in stage 5 and 6, but often they're going to be stuck in a stage 3 or 4. So at this point, you might be wondering where are these stages coming from? What do they mean? These stages come from Kohlberg's moral development model. Stage 3 and 4 is considered level 2 in moral development and has to do with conforming to the status quo. People in this stage believe that it is moral to obey the laws, actively maintaining, supporting, and justifying the order. We can infer that people in these stages will believe that everything can be solved by law and order. So after you hear that, I'm wondering what types of people come to mind. Because for me, I've definitely seen this in the last few weeks online when people are arguing. There is definitely a lot of people attaching themselves to a status quo line of thinking, whether or not that is for good reasons or good intentions or bad intentions. And I think is particularly relevant in the discussion of defunding the police and some kind of ignorant people victim blaming essentially for Black people who have been murdered by police. So those are stages 3 and 4. Some brief information of stages 5 and 6. These stages introduce the emphasis on individual moral values and principles that exist outside of authority and groups. Stage 5, or the social contract legalistic orientation, in particular introduces the possibility of changing law in terms of rational considerations of social utility. So again, if we think about the example of defunding the police, pretty evident there. So next, stage 6 is called the universal ethical principle orientation. I'll post what the article says, but from my understanding, this is the stage where you're able to come up with your own set of ethical principles and your conscious decisions adhere to those. The article says that the principles are not like the 10 commandments, which I thought was hilarious and a pretty good way to paint the picture of abstract thinking. These principles are more abstract in nature, but still appeal to logical comprehensiveness, universality, and consistency. How do you pronounce universality? But yeah, so even though they're principles, they're not set in stone rules that are very easy to follow. They're abstract, but they all still have an element of logic and universality and consistency. All right, so reading from the article here, at heart, these are universal principles of justice, of the reciprocity and equality of human rights, and of respect for the dignity of human beings as individual persons. Okay, so as I've been kind of saying throughout, let's apply these 2 stages to defunding the police. Stage 3 or 4 means you probably immediately dismiss the notion it goes against law and order. Transitioning from 4 to 5, so people kind of in the middle, would mean you're open to it and you probably have already shared posts about it or parroted what you've heard. 5, you've probably heard everything and did a little bit of research on your own and think it makes sense, so you push for it. 6, you probably hear it, then start with research. As you learn more, you make connections between the concept and your own principles and logic. Eventually, you'll come to an understanding and then either argue for it or against it. Long story short, stages 5 and 6 is probably where we want to be at morally as a society or as individuals. To wrap up this section of what is moral development, I wanted to go into what the article talks about for moral judgment versus moral action. If logical reasoning is a necessary but not sufficient condition for mature moral judgment is a necessary but not sufficient condition for mature moral action. One cannot follow moral principles if one does not understand or believe in moral principles. However, one can reason in terms of principles and not live up to these principles. For example, Richard Krebs and I found that only 15% of students showing some principled thinking cheated as compared to 55% of conventional students and 70% of pre-conventional students. Nevertheless, 15% of the principled individuals did cheat. That 15% of the principled students were found to cheat suggests that factors additional to moral judgment are necessary for the translation of principled moral reasoning into moral action. Among these additional factors, we can say that the individual's behavior depends in part on motives and emotions and in part on a general sense of will, purpose, or equal strength. So the reason I want to end this section off with that, though, is to keep in mind that no matter how moral you may be, there's always room for error, and there are always additional factors that come into play with any decision and any circumstance. And that is why you should be empathetic and try to understand other individuals and other situational kind of circumstances or whatnot. And I'm not trying to push an agenda or anything with that, it's just to put it out there. I think that's always a very necessary way to navigate any sort of complex situation. Moving on, we're going to talk about two key factors for moral development: discussion and environment. Discussion and environment I'm taking from the article. I don't think it really lays it out exactly like that. I think the article talks about something a little bit different in terms of reconstruction of role taking and reconception of justice. To be honest, I don't really understand it completely, so I'm just going to translate this into a way that I understand and a way that I think is still applicable and makes sense. So the article talks about a study that they did in the school, comparing multiple classes over the course of a semester and seeing how they could develop morality essentially through discussion. For context, the important conditions for successful moral discussions seem to be: 1. Exposure to the next higher stage of reasoning. 2. Exposure to situations posing problems and contradictions for the child's current moral structure, leading to dissatisfaction with his or her current level. And 3. An atmosphere of interchange and dialogue, combining the first two conditions, in which conflicting moral views are compared in an open manner. Studies of families in India and America suggest that morally advanced children have parents who are at higher moral stages. These parents expose their children to the next higher moral stage, raising moral issues and engaging in open dialogue or interchange about such issues. So using these, Kohlberg and Blatt created this study. So Blatt and Kohlberg essentially came up with a system of classroom discussion. And basically all these discussions begin with conflict-laden moral discussions, or dilemmas is I think how they put it. Basically polarizing issues, which a lot of people seem to shy away from nowadays. So the article doesn't really go into depth in terms of what the control and experimental group setup was. I think it said 4 classes. Yeah, so 4 classes of junior high and high school students for a semester. And I'm assuming the control group didn't have this system of discussion, and the experimental groups did have this system. And I guess they tested students according to the Kohlberg stages of moral development, beginning of semester, end of semester. So what was the system? The system was presenting these kind of moral dilemmas for students to begin discussing about. They noticed that the students were, after initial testing, typically of 3 stages, 2, 3, or 4. So putting them all together and giving them a moral dilemma, obviously the discussions are going to probably get a little bit messy and all over the place. And they used the teacher as the instrumental kind of facilitator and guide, so to speak, for these classes. The teacher would sympathize not with the lowest stage, but the one right above them. So if there was 2, 3, and 4, the teacher would sympathize or argue with the mind or the perspective of a stage 3 rather than stage 2 and rather than stage 4. So when the teacher is coming at this discussion from a perspective of a stage 3, eventually the stage 2 kids caught up and were able to see the contradictions of their stage 2 reasoning and then begin to argue at a stage 3. And that's when the teacher would then go up to a stage 4 level of reasoning and argue from that perspective and eventually get the 3s all up to stage 4. So it's very incremental and step by step. Now, the article doesn't say exactly how the teacher engaged in discussion, but it does say that the teacher's kind of method of, I guess, empathizing or arguing is to just clarify arguments. So what I think we can garner from that, and it's not mentioned in the article, so I could be wrong, is that if you have a bunch of people who are at different stages, so we have 2, 3, and 4 in this scenario, when you just leave them to argue, they're going to not be able to understand one another. So I think what the teacher is doing here is just simply translating and clarifying. So for example, if stage 2 and 3 are arguing, there's a high likelihood or possibility that stage 2 will simply just not understand what stage 3 is saying. So the teacher comes in and kind of just eases in the understanding, presents it in a much more approachable and digestible way. And in doing so, eventually stage 2 will understand that argument, hopefully see the merit of it, and then they'll start arguing from that perspective. But then we still have those stage 4 kids. So the teacher will then adopt that perspective and then again just ease the conversation into understanding what the stage 4 perspective is. So in terms of results, it seems that at the end of the semesters, they retested the students and noticed that anybody who was in the control group, which I have determined to be, I think, people who don't have these discussions or these systems, or maybe they have the discussions, but the teacher doesn't mediate in that way, they didn't really show any development in the course of the experiment. Essentially no change is what the article says in moral stage level. Whereas in the experimental classrooms, from 1/4 to 1/2 the students moved up a moral stage. So we see that this approach is very effective. So really what we see here is that it's a very good indicator that the context that we went over right before discussing it are very accurate. So exposure to the next higher stage of reasoning, we saw that in stage 2 and 3, and then 3 to 4. Exposure to situations posing problems and contradictions for the child's current moral structure, leading to dissatisfaction with his or her current level. So these moral dilemmas presented in classrooms probably left some of these kids in stage 2 or 3 dissatisfied with their reasoning. Like they couldn't argue and it didn't make sense, and what the other people were saying kind of made sense, but they didn't quite get it. And that's where the third point comes in: an atmosphere of interchange and dialogue, combining the first two conditions in which conflicting moral views are compared in an open manner. So I feel like these people in stage 2 or 3 needed to be an environment where open discussion was encouraged, and they're not going to be blasted for having stage 2 thinking or stage 3 thinking. And the person that really facilitated that in this experiment was the teacher, to make people feel like they're safe to present their own opinions, because people need to sometimes even just hear what they're saying to really realize how messed up or contradictory or incorrect it might be, where they can see the inconsistencies with what they're saying. They can see that they are struggling to really argue their point. And once they feel that, then obviously they need the exposure to the next stage in order to see, oh, there's an alternative way of thinking, and I can adopt that into my own rhetoric, and now I understand stage 3. Further takeaways is that this happened over the course of a semester, and I'm not sure if it was a daily thing or like a once a week type of thing, but consistency and over the course of a period of time. One conversation is not enough to really get this accomplished. Also, the stage 4s and 2s are put together, but I highly doubt that they made any progress in terms of their discussion. So you really, if you're at a stage 4 and you're arguing with somebody at a stage 2, you got to argue with them at a stage 3 level, and then eventually you can argue at your stage 4 level. These are invariant sequences. You can't expect people to skip a stage entirely. So if you do choose to engage in discourse or argue with somebody about the racism and stuff like that, try to see what stage they're at before engaging in discussion with them, because that will highly influence how you speak to them. Okay, let's move on. Environment. So the article moves on to talk about the second area of growth. And the article says that it is the moral atmosphere of the home, the school, and broader society. In other words, the environment that a person is in. And continuing, the article says, the first basic dimension of social atmosphere is the role-taking opportunities it provides, the extent to which it encourages a person to take the view of others. The second dimension of social atmosphere, more strictly moral, is the level of justice within the environment or institution. The justice structure of an institution refers to the perceived rules or principles for distributing rewards, punishments, responsibilities, and privileges among institutional members. And then they bring up a study of a traditional prison, which revealed that inmates perceived it as a stage 1 regardless of their own level. And they compare that to a behavior modification prison, which used point rewards for conformity, was perceived at the stage 2 system of instrumental exchange. Inmates who were at stage 3 or 4 perceived this institution as more fair than the traditional prison, as it should be. It's talking about the prison, and then it goes on to another experiment that they did with the school in reforming policies and how things worked, I guess, essentially in order to cultivate an atmosphere that was much more morally higher up in the developmental model, or in terms of stages. If you want to read about it, highly recommend this article. For our purposes, I think the takeaway from this section was that regardless of your own level, you can perceive an environment to be of a lower stage, and I'm assuming that that means the way you act will reflect that stage as well, especially if you're trying to survive in it and try to, you have to fit in. And I think that's where socioeconomic status will definitely play a role. But overall, the really important parts of this little section and discussion of environment is that it shows the importance of experience and just life experience. Essentially, people who have worn different shoes or hats, so to speak, they will have a lot more life experience, and because of that, they're able to have a higher moral reasoning because they've seen multiple different perspectives. So we have to be mindful of people who do not have that, which again could be very closely tied to privilege. They will be lower in moral reasoning, and that doesn't excuse their actions, but that's one way that we can understand people who haven't really gone past, let's say, stage 2 or 3 or 4 of moral reasoning. And that can be explained by perhaps a lack of experiences of being in different roles. And with these examples of the traditional prison and the behavior modification prison, I wish they had gone more into depth, or I wish I could understand it a little bit better. They talk about setting up a social contract between guards and inmates. I'm fairly certain that I'm just not understanding this prison section, and I apologize that I cannot analyze it proficiently. But what I'm taking away from it is that moral development is really dependent on role taking, as well as believing that the environment around you is at an appropriately high moral stage. So moving on to the final kind of section here is application. How do we apply all of this to today? And this is kind of getting into why I'm even talking about this in the first place, but I really do think that there is a lapse in moral reasoning in online discussions and discourse. So for true application, I think the best place to start is to assess yourself, because you need to know where are you in this scale of moral development in order to be able to identify people who are at a lower stage and then help bring them up to a higher stage of moral reasoning. Now we can base this off of, I guess, pre-established models, such as Kohlberg's model. What I would recommend is go through the stages, just Google Kohlberg's moral development model, read each stage and see where you fit in, because I think I don't think there is a detriment of trying to classify yourself according to this model from what I've read. I think it is a pretty accurate depiction of moral development, but obviously this is technically a pretty dated model and probably doesn't reflect a lot of little nuances of modern society. So take everything with a grain of salt. But that's why I mentioned at the beginning that I think there's a general trend of people thinking kind of inwardly and selfishly for lower stages, and then that begins to go out as you go up in stages. You begin to really empathize more and take the perspectives of others. What I really do like about Kohlberg's model is that in stage 6, it ends with very strong self-principles, and you're kind of moving and making decisions in accordance to those ethics and those principles while still being logical and respective of laws and order. And I'm hoping that eventually there'll be a talk of culture and that kind of stuff as well. But ultimately, you're thinking for yourself, and the assumption is that things like equality and human rights is deeply ingrained into stage 6. So anyways, that's assessment. To kind of elaborate and reiterate, the reason we begin with assessment is because if you're really in a stage 6 of moral development, then you should be able to enter the shoes of someone in a stage 3, 2, 4, 5, 1. This doesn't mean that dealing with those people isn't frustrating, but I do see a lot of people trying to fight for what's good who cannot understand people in stage 3 at all. To me, this shows that they're in fact a stage 3 or 4 themselves and just being anti-racist because they're conforming to what they think is symbolic of law and order. And in case you forgot, it's because stage 3 or 4 has to do with conforming to the status quo. So if the status quo in their immediate community is being anti-racist, as good as that is, they're not going to be able to convince somebody who is also in a stage 3 or 4 that being anti-racist is good. Obviously, it's much more nuanced than that, but hopefully you get my point. The next point of application is obviously in arguments then, right? Arguing with somebody who is a racist and being anti-racist is spending time with these people to progressively work through the stages through empathy and understanding their point of view, seeing how we can lead them to a better understanding of racism. So much like the school study, we want to be able to understand where they're coming from and then work through. I think a great example of this is actually for people like me, second-gen Asians, the whole Asian community's contribution or whatever dilemma for Black Lives Matter, where a lot of younger Asian Americans are conforming to this idea that all first-generation immigrants need to be spoken and saved and educated by the second generation woke Asian Americans. And in many ways that is true, and that's a discussion that absolutely needs to take place in our community. But again, the signs there I see is just a lot of conformity without understanding the actual issues. There's a lot of people not understanding the culture of the first generation immigrants. But before I get too distracted, because that's a huge topic of its own, the main point there is that if you want to convince a racist immigrant or Fabi Asian, you have to be able to take their stance. All right, let's finish this video. Okay, so where were we? So when you are speaking with first generation immigrants, start where they are. And if where they started is having very bad experiences with Black people, you have to start there and assume that role. Most of us have probably had prejudice against a certain group of people based on our experience and just anecdotal stories. We can understand where that comes from, and we can understand that it is short-sighted, but you have to work from there and then begin to separate that from the larger issue of systemic racism and really get these people on the same page. And you do that through empathy and bringing yourself back to that stage and starting there. And that's, as a side note, the only thing that I can really argue against in terms of these stages of development is that I think what it insinuates is that a person who is morally higher is somehow more correct or morally superior. Where I think you can have an individual, let's say a first generation immigrant, who is at the same moral stage as you, and there is no superior inferior type of relationship here. It's a little bit more dependent on roles and experiences, like in the discussion of environment. If you just don't have access to a certain point of view, you're not going to get it. Even if you are at a stage 6 in moral reasoning, we had that example earlier of the kids still cheating, even though that they have the principle and know why they shouldn't cheat and agree that they shouldn't cheat. Some circumstances lead them to. So even if you're at a stage 5 or 6 moral reasoning, you're not superior, and you can also make the same mistakes. So I think when we are trying to argue against, or not even argue against, when we are trying to educate our immigrant parents, it's purely based on the assumption that they just don't have the same point of view and experiences as you. It should not be going in being looking for them to be at a stage 3 or 4 thinking and being like, oh, I'm a 5 or 6. I'm going to teach you how to get to 5 or 6. It's not that. And I think in all of these interactions that or discussions that we have with other people, we have to call ourselves out if we're beginning to think that way, because it is not about that. It's about bringing the discussion and the environment up to a stage 6, not trying to really walk with the person and teach them to be a stage 6. And I think maybe I didn't make that distinction very well in this video, but hopefully you make it far enough where you can hear it, because it isn't definitely, I don't think it's a superior, inferior type of thing. It's just elevating the conversation and the social environment. Final type of application for moral development through discussion, I think it has to do with also developing people who are on your side. Like for me, I'm on the side of anti-racism. I think it's a no-brainer. And I see other people who are also on my side, where they're trying to be anti-racist and trying to argue with these people who are clearly racist. But I've seen too many cases of people I can't even call it moral reasoning or reasoning, because all I see is like people spamming no, 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 or you are part of the problem, or how can you think like it? So it's it's kind of like what I mentioned before. They're clearly not capable of moral reasoning at stage of 5 or 6. They're kind of stuck in stage 3 or 4 and trying to argue against somebody with the same kind of framework, which obviously probably won't go anywhere. Because I think that in order to make somebody who is racist understand that they need to not be racist is a moral issue. I think it is a lapse in moral understanding of understanding somebody living in a completely racist experience and system. The average person probably cannot empathize with that. I can't empathize with that. It really takes morality and principles to begin to create a framework of understanding, and that is what should fuel your anti-racism, not conformity, not out of respect for authority on Instagram, like the Instagram police. It should be born of your own set of ethics and principles and logic. So when you see somebody who is trying to help the cause of anti-racism, but they're doing more damage than any help, I think that's when you should intervene and really get them up to a stage 6 as well, in order to elevate, again, the discussion to a stage 6. Because more likely than not, an anti-racist who is arguing in that sort of perspective is just going to reinforce the racism of the person also in that perspective, because they're just going to be like, oh, it's another snowflake liberal, blah, 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 which is probably one of the last things that we want, because that really solidifies this culture of hate and being tired of being politically correct. So call that out. And sorry, I just don't have the stamina to record this. Anyways, the next section, environment. So taking what we learned from the importance of environment, I think a really good application of using environment for moral reasoning is in the argument against black on black crime, or people who have only had racist experiences with black people, particularly in black on black crime. No surprise, we see this a lot in All Lives Matter, that group of people online, convincing people and showing people that environment really has a lot to do with moral development, is to, again, kind of cultivate understanding. And I see this popping up a lot in the discussion of defunding the police. Some people are talking about bringing up facts about black on black crime. And then again, there are people who only have had bad experiences with black people, so they have that bad image of them, which kind of leads to their apathy during this period of time. So we really just have to not focus on calling people racist or calling these people not important, like your experience experience is not important. Their pain is so much greater. We can't approach it like that. We have to show them that their experience is true and valid, that if they have been robbed by Black people, then they have been robbed by Black people. But you have to separate that experience from this greater systemic experience of Black people and show them the horror of that. And then if we're talking about Black on Black crime, or perhaps it's an issue, honestly, I think it's more of an issue of socioeconomic environments, and there's a bit of classism and all that stuff there. But that can all be linked towards racism, because I think even if the direct cause of a dangerous neighborhood is socioeconomic issues, the reason those issues exist and the reason that there's these environments where people cannot grow from a moral development perspective, that probably traces back to racism and the messed up system over the last 400 years that has really perpetuated these sorts of patterns into society. So anyone who wants to talk about facts and numbers like that, they should be really going back further and seeing what the causes of all those modern day problems are. Next thing for environment. So that should inform your tangible way of donating or helping shape reformation in systems that perpetuate some bad environments. So what I just said, we have to challenge laws and also standard practices in all realms of society, from schools to retail stores to federal laws. We must always be assessing and reassessing. And this popped up in our defining of stage 5, right? Where stage 5 begins to introduce the possibility that laws are not perfect, right? And we can begin to question the efficacy of certain laws that were obviously made with a certain agenda in mind. So if you're at a stage 3 or 4, again, you're not going to be questioning that. So when you are surrounded by people who are stage 3 and 4, you can't condemn them. You have to bring them up into a stage 5 by posing dilemmas, maybe bring up laws that are very questionable, or the erasure of certain laws, or the correction, of certain laws in other societies, or even in our own society in the past where we've corrected and gotten rid of laws or improve them. Work slowly, create this environment at a societal level, starting with your community, retail stores, federal laws, all this stuff. And that's the next point. If we're not really sure, we can start by making our workplace environments or our friend groups or our families to reflect a higher moral stage, either through discussions or activities. And again, here, progressive stages is important to fend off the feeling of alienation or marginalization. We must practice empathy and understanding. There's a reason why people believe in reverse racism, I think, and it's probably because of tone, and probably because people have really tried to simplify empathy and morality and progression or learning. And obviously it probably comes from a place of frustration perhaps, or from a place of they're not at a high moral stage as well. So what they've done is contribute to the problem by creating more of these distractions, such as the discussion of reverse racism, which shouldn't need to be discussed if we had approached it correctly from the get-go. So again, work on your immediate environments, but be mindful, be empathetic. If we can bring the people around us and then eventually general society to a stage 6 of moral development, hopefully that can cultivate environments for all social classes and all races to develop morality, resulting in more adults who go past stages 3 and 4. I think the stat was for adolescents and adults, 50% of them do not get past that stage. And that is probably a very alarming issue and accounts for a lot of the issues that we face today, centered around human rights and things that should, some people see as no-brainers, but clearly they're not. And the final application, moral reasoning in a world of facts. This is an assumption of mine or an observation of mine, but I've seen that there's this kind of fetish for facts nowadays, and there are people that think only empirical evidence can explain anything. My guess is that reflects somebody who is either in between stages 3 or 4, maybe even 5. And some people have a belief that hard facts top everything and that we live in an objective world. I mean, this topic could be its own separate video, so I won't really go in depth on it. But I think the reason moral development exists is so that people can maneuver in life without having to research every single step. There's a certain level of efficiency in living that personal ethics and reasoning provides. We're able to make decisions without having to rely on hard facts, which can be manipulated or unavailable if we are in a stage 6 moral reasoning. So you might have noticed that during this Black Lives Matters surge in 2020. There's so much information out there, so many documentaries and essays and books and songs and poems and just everything. There's a lot of information. And let's be real, who's going to go through all of that? Who's going to be able to go through all of that? We can't. It's a matter of time and priorities. People still have financial responsibilities, filial responsibilities, and you can't expect people to go through all the material. And I think that applies with just life in general. You're not going to be able to know the hard facts of everything that you need to argue. Sometimes you need to argue without facts. That's just the fact of the matter. And also in that discussion of people using facts, such as black on black crime, as a way to kind of derail the arguments of others, I think that's biased usage of facts, where it doesn't really matter whatever the numbers are. Whether or not those numbers are true, they don't account for the causation of it in other realms of society. So being able to kind of see something from a larger moral perspective, I think, is a much more efficient way of living, that you don't have to rely on facts. Mind you, there's a whole section of rhetoric about the rhetoric of science as well. There's tobacco companies paying off researchers and doctors to publish papers about, how safe and not killing cigarettes are. Facts can be manipulated. And in the case of the Asian parents that might just not have the experience of living with Black people in everyday society, that is an instance of facts being unavailable. Facts used loosely there, but that's a lack of information. So what moral reasoning provides is that when you are in an environment or position where you do not have access to facts, or that you are being inundated with people using biased facts, you have to be able to make your own decision that is based upon your own, logical capabilities and your own ethics and understandings of human rights and equality and justice and all that good stuff, to be able to make a decision on your own and to become self-sufficient in your opinions on matters, to know when it's appropriate to take a step back and research, and to also have to make a call or decision without confirming certain facts. But anyways, long rant. Thank you for listening thus far. If you've made it, geez, I don't know how long this video is going to be. But like the other videos, I would like to end with a prompt, and that prompt is going to be, what moral stage are you at? And how can you begin to advance to the next stage? If you are at a stage 6, how are you going to be elevating the environment and the discourse of people around you to a stage 6 moral reasoning? How are you going to help the moral development of the community and society at large? How are you going to help cultivate environments? That was a mouthful. Hopefully this has been useful. I think that this is imperative that we all really try to implement in our daily lives. And I'm hoping that, maybe I'll try to cut this up into bite-sized chunks, but please, if you've learned anything from this, share this video. If you don't feel like that's an appropriate act to do, or if it's insensitive in this time of BLM, take these and apply them to your own life, please, because I think this is really a great long-term first step in how we can really eradicate racism in our society and bigotry and just being stupidity, really. I think we can really make a strong push to get rid of that. Anyways, thank you. Bye-bye.